Every time I try to answer the question, is Monster Hunter Wilds good? I come up with a different answer. There are many things I appreciate about it. Monsters like Ray Dow are among the most original and visually impressive I've seen. The effort and care put into the environment details is unparalleled as far as I'm concerned. And it's just plain satisfying to pull off a lot of the flashy attacks and counters on offer. When I focus on positives like that, it feels like the answer is, of course, the game is objectively good. But it has a number of acute flaws, and when I think of it purely as a Monster Hunter game, I quickly find myself thinking, surely this is the worst one. However, I'm not sure I should even be thinking of it in that sort of context, because this series is quickly discarding most of the things which I thought were core to the experience. This topic has been discussed a lot over the past couple of years and was quite prevalent leading up to the release of Wilds. And while it's still very relevant within the community, I feel like it's being somewhat drowned out by more surface level issues and points around design that are quite narrowly focused. The aim of this video is to shave away some of the issues that aren't meaningful to the series' future and offer a new perspective on some of the fundamental changes that continue to evolve. I hope to spark some discussion while the devs will likely be most attentive, and importantly, I don't want to just whinge about why Wilds is a bad game. Rather, I want to observe the differences, see how they affect the experience, and make a case for why some of the approaches taken in the past made the series stand out among other action RPGs. I should mention that I've been playing since the PSP days of Freedom Unite, so I'm sure some of my takes will come across firmly in the classic games were best category. So to all the world babies watching, feel free to let out a sigh of disappointment now. In all seriousness, I think many people who started with Monster Hunter World will find a lot of common ground here. And even some of the grumpy Rise babies, since I guess that's a thing now? As a brief aside, there will be no story spoilers, but I will be talking about endgame content and have late game monster footage throughout the video. Okay, intro over. Chuck this up on your second monitor and let's get to it. I want to start by defining what things are and aren't meaningful for this video. I'm going to propose two main categories for the Monster Hunter Wilds discussion. The first I call superficial issues. Now I think many people will hear that and assume it's a pejorative, that I'm just dismissing these issues. And that's not the case. I think these are valid criticisms and should be complained about. But they're the types of problems where the consequences are likely unintended by the developers, and many will be addressed in minor updates, title updates, or the expansion. I think the clearest example I can give you is the game crashing. Unless you think the developers are sitting in their lair scheming about how to make players miserable and ruin their own review scores, I think we can be so bold as to say they wish the game never crashed. I'll go through some more concrete examples with nuance in a moment. But that's superficial issues in a nutshell, and it's not what I want to focus on. The other category, the one I do want to focus on, I'm calling fundamental design. And these are the things that are intentionally designed for. They're baked deeply into the core of the game, you experience them everywhere as you play, and they're what the game's identity is built upon. They not only represent changes from the past games, but I think are certainly indicative of where the future of the series is going. So we have superficial issues and fundamental design. I want to go through a few examples of superficial issues first, and I'll start with the topic of technical stability, performance, and networking issues. When I look through most of the negative reviews on Steam, I think this is the primary focus. And I agree it's a huge problem. I experienced it a lot throughout my playthrough. But it's obviously not what the devs intended. There's no world in which they think people who respond to SOS flares should get disconnected mid-hunt and finish it on their own. I suspect this is their highest priority to address in upcoming updates. The next superficial issue I'll talk about is the game's usability. The game's menus are cumbersome. Many things get easily missed. For example, I didn't realize you could craft talismans till pretty late in the game, and I didn't realize you could upgrade them till much later. And don't get me started on Alma walking around town. For God's sake, who thought the most important NPC should not be stuck in one spot? Or, the people who want to share a meal with you, but only while you're in another town. Ugh. Okay, I'm not sure how many of these will actually get addressed, but obviously the designers don't want you to be overwhelmed and confused while playing. Well, maybe confusing is actually a core design principle of Monster Hunter. At least something is carrying over across games. The last superficial issue I'll talk about is what some people call the hollow end game. Anecdotally, this is probably the most common problem I've heard people complain about, at least in my sphere. And once again, I agree. It feels like High Rank's ending was pretty unceremonious. I don't like the Arshan crafting system, I don't think it's very interesting, and in fact, I think it's somewhat antithetical to Monster Hunter, since I'm not hunting monsters to make materials from them. The decoration grind isn't particularly interesting, and the top end of pretty much every progression is gated by Hunter Symbol 3, which results in constant hunting of the same few tempered monsters, and that gets boring. My reservation here is that we know this is going to be addressed. The title update announcements are explicit about that. Moreover, the endgame is always lengthened and improved upon through updates and expansions. It is unambiguously going to get addressed, at least in some form, so I don't personally see a lot of value in continuing to berate Capcom about it for now. Okay, so game stability, usability, and endgame content are all examples of superficial issues. Again, I really want to stress that I still think they are absolutely valid criticisms of the game in its release state, but I don't think they'll be what we're concerned with when talking about Monster Hunter Wilds 2 years from now, when the game's design is completely locked in. Now, there's one last thing I want to touch on before moving on to the fundamental design, and that's purely bad design. An example of bad design in my books might be how the developers clearly wanted the player to explore and discover their meticulously designed mini open world maps. And yet, while playing through the story, they take every chance to slowly walk you through each area and force you to look at many of these details. All sense of exploration and discovery fade away when the game walks you to a tree, tears off a leaf, puts it in your hand and says, "Isn't it cool that you found this?" So that's an example where I think the design isn't having its intended experience at all. Maybe I'm missing something here, but try to stay with me for the sake of the example. I want to make it clear that when I talk about game design for the rest of this video, it concerns design which, as far as we can tell, is largely having its intended effect on the experience, for better or worse. Let's move on to the meat of this video. Fundamental design. These are the aspects which I think drive the experience you feel when playing and make up the game's identity. These are also changes which only seem to be growing with each release. The first fundamental design change I want to mention is the narrowing of mastery. And by that, I'm not referring to the games becoming easier. Difficulty is of course critical to the Monster Hunter experience, but the conversation around difficulty is booming, and other people have and will do a better job of explaining it than I ever could. Instead, the narrowing of mastery is a less overt, but no less important part that I haven't seen expressed quite in this way. I'm talking about a shift from asking the player to master multiple aspects of the game to mostly just focusing on the one. Now, there are many ways you could define mastery in Monster Hunter, but in this one, there are 3 primary areas to build skill and knowledge in: the weapons, the monsters, and the environments. Traditionally, Monster Hunter sits somewhere in the middle, and that's where I liked it most. I'd argue the series is becoming razor focused on the weapons though, but let's look at each area in detail. Let's start with weapons. In Monster Hunter, weapon controls have always been seen as complex and clunky, many of the mechanics for them obfuscated. Over time, the weapons have been becoming faster and more fluid, and getting more actions and inputs. The optimal mode of play for each weapon has become less obvious as well. I think Longsword is a great example for this. In the classic games, you built up spirit gauge with most of your attacks, choosing the right one based on timing, damage, and positioning, and whenever you had a big opening, you just unleashed your spirit combo, and that was basically it. Now it has multiple parries with trade-offs, and there's a benefit to stay in your red spirit form, but you also want to consume it for your helm breaker. I had to watch a guide to figure it all out. With those extra attacks and mechanics like parries, offset attacks, perfect guards, and the focus strikes, there's a stronger emphasis on choosing which of your many attacks is the right one in this moment. And of course, some of those moves are just plain flashy and feel cool when executed correctly. Overall, there is just far more you can do with any weapon now. Now, this isn't to say weapons are more difficult to play effectively or more satisfying to master, partly because those reactionary mechanics are spread across all weapons now, giving each one less of its own unique identity, and partly because the clunkiness of attacks, the game difficulty, and the combat pace in older games made it far more important to know when you could safely commit to offense. More on some of that stuff later. Beyond those factors though, previous entries in the series filled in some of the gaps in weapon function with other skills, which brings me to monsters. The core of Monster Hunter combat comes down to responding to the threat of a monster with your weapon's actions. But the dynamics have changed a lot. It's easy to look at monsters in classic games like 4 Ultimate, compare them to Wilds, and notice monsters in the older games not only look, but often behave according to simpler rules, and then leap to the conclusion that they offer less mastery. And I think many people who share my position might be tempted to point out certain monsters that were designed specifically to be challenging, like the deviant monsters in Generations Ultimate, as counterexamples. However, I think it gets difficult to accurately compare monsters like that, and it isn't necessary. I think it's much more straightforward to directly compare some of the most basic monsters. Let's look at Chowdercabra and the Bull Drone. Both are basically starter monsters. Both are very easy for an experienced player. Chowdercabra mostly allows the player to just test out their weapon against a mobile training dummy. It shows you that monsters have different attacks, but almost none of its attacks are particularly punishing. They do minor damage and maybe trip you over, and he has a single, well-telegraphed jumping attack that will send you flying. All in all, a monster fight in its most gentle form. I actually think it's great for beginners. Now let's contrast that with the Bull Drone. Depending on the game, this may be the very first monster you hunt. It has around 3 attacks, and follows a very simple formula. If you're not roughly in front of it, it'll toss its tusks and turn towards you. If you are in front, it'll scrape its hooves and charge at you. When it's enraged, it'll give less warning for a charge and occasionally rampage all around the room. Now if you get hit by its charge and have starting armor, it will hurt you, and your character will get tossed aside like a small child. The monsters in this world are dangerous. Ignore what they're doing at your own peril. If you learn to attack the Bull Drone from the side or the rear, and take breaks to let it attack, it's a very easy enemy. Now if you go a little further and realize that this boss has a tiny amount of health, and the fight is lengthened from all the running around and dodging of its charges, you kind of figure out that if you could just keep it still, you should be able to kill it super fast. So if you bring traps or a hammer to knock it out, the fight becomes a joke, over in seconds. Now, while I'm not about to die on the hill of Bull Drone as the perfect beginner boss fight, I do think it shows a difference in the design philosophy. The monster is punishing for a lot of new players, but it has a very simple set of behaviors, and if you just consider what you could do to overcome them, suddenly knowledge of the monster has become a weapon, and it's more than just learning when to attack at the right times. Again, I like both of these monsters. They're just designed with different priorities in mind. Now look, very few monsters in the classic games are as simple or exploitable as the Bull Drone, but the wide majority ask you to think harder about what unique challenges they present and how you might deal with them. Whereas in Wilds, I found my approach to almost every boss came down to what are the patterns, the timings, and the hitboxes. In Generations Ultimate, I need sonic bombs for Cephadrome. I should bring tainted meat for Deviljho. I need to hero dive to avoid Rathalos' claw attack, and I can turn Diablos' charge against it by getting its horns stuck in a wall. In Wilds, if we take a reductionist perspective, most monsters can be reduced down to a collection of telegraphs and hitboxes, and as a player, your skill at beating them can be measured exclusively by how well you've memorized those patterns. Those still are typically the most important aspects of monsters in the previous entries, but it's rare to find a monster that can be reduced only to those elements when they have the kind of gimmicks I mentioned before. And it's not like the designers on Wilds can't make monsters like this. Fighting Rathalos in Wilds can have it spending a frustrating amount of time flying if you don't bring flash pods. And when I was fighting Gravios with the insect glaive, I found myself using aerial attacks much more than usual, because I bounced off his legs and got hit by area attacks on the ground. So unless these factors are designed by accident, I think it shows that the developers know how to make planning and analysis at least slightly more important, but it's not what they want for most hunts. I want to stress, if you enjoy the constant offensive uptime and not have that experience interrupted, then of course that's fine, and it's great that this game caters to your interests so much. It's just not what I prefer, nor do I think it's as a unique experience. Let's talk environment. This is the other area of mastery which the series seems to be shifting away from. Similar to monsters, it's easy to look at the modern maps, notice there's a lot more stuff, and come to the conclusion that there's more to learn and master. But I would describe the environments as being densely packed with low-meaning interactions, and classic games as being sparsely packed with high-meaning interactions. In older games, if you don't take the time to gather honey, you simply won't have access to a number of useful items, particularly mega potions. And taking time to gather honey is exactly as it sounds. It's out of your way, you have to sit through animations, and if you don't learn where the honey nodes are in each map, you're not going to accrue much. If you're a skilled player, that can be okay. You can get by with herbs and potions until you unlock the farm, but that's a deliberate decision. In Wilds, you autopath to the monster on your Sacred and aim your slinger while travelling. Enough honey nodes are placed along the common travel routes, and a single slinger grab will net you multiple units of honey. And similar logic extends to many other environmental features. In classic games, if you want to craft a lot of gear, or want to have a lot of spare resources to turn into money, you should be keeping an eye out for rare mining and bug nodes, and deciding whether or not it's worth pausing to gather them. In Wilds, there's almost no demand to memorize important gathering points and maps. We can also extend this to monster encounters. Each area in the classic games is essentially a small combat arena, and each one has features and quirks to learn. Lure the monster to the spot where you do mounting attacks. Lead it away from the exits so you don't get knocked into the next zone. Use the log to take cover and sharpen, but it will break eventually. At a macro level, it's also meaningful. If you know which area the monster spawns in and where it'll go if left alone for a minute, you can decide where you want to fight it, and even set up a trap directly under where it will fly to. Oh, and in high rank, you spawn in a random location with no map or supplies. So if you haven't learned the maps by then, you're straight up going to be lost. Similar logic can be applied to Monster Hunter World, where you have to manually navigate a large and complex map and make use of the scout flies to find your target. When some people hear this, they might say, but wait, what about all the environmental interactions like vine traps, falling rocks, or flash flies? Doesn't that give the environment more meaningful interactions in Wild? My response to that is yes and no. I do appreciate that over time while playing Wilds, I learned that there are certain map features I could exploit to my advantage. However, the skill ceiling for these features is very low. They can be activated from a distance and with minimal effort via the slinger, and it's pretty clear that the monsters deliberately move from area to area in such a way that perfectly places them in danger of these features. Now, I'm not trying to say that slowly gathering herbs or being lost in a map is unambiguously great design that other games need to copy, but I am saying that there were many details to learn about each map, and there is a strong benefit to being aware of them, and I just don't feel the same about Wilds. Okay, let's go back to the diagram. So as I said before, the older games sat somewhere in the middle when it comes to mastery on offer for these three areas. The weapons were complex and esoteric, the combat was clunky and hard to adapt to, but there's still a hell of a lot of skill to build here. More importantly, not only can gaps in weapon actions be compensated by these other factors, but the games were designed around having a much richer understanding of the individual monsters and the environments that you hunt in. As for modern Monster Hunter, it seems with each iteration we go further and further towards total focus on weapon skill. The monsters and environments are purposefully built in a way where they don't interfere with your ability to face down your enemy and execute the attacks and reactions of your weapon. And that segues into the next fundamental design topic. With the growing focus on weapons and combat, there's an impetus to remove any friction that gets in the way of fighting. Well, almost anything. We'll talk about story and slowly walking around maps in a bit. As I said before, mastery over the environment was prominent in the previous games, and that has a wide range of factors. Now there is no tracking of monsters, they're always visible on the map. Your sacred automatically takes you straight to them. And the most important map features like vine traps are set up in such a way that takes minimal effort to utilize. The map designs have also been homogenized. Sure, you have varying levels of openness to each area, and there are elements like the falling rocks, but otherwise their differences matter very little. The presence of ledges mattered a lot in the older games, since this might be your only way of getting a mount. Now, if I want to mount a monster, I just summon and jump off my sacred a couple of times. Environmental hazards were once a key factor. If you forgot hot or cool drinks in the older games, that could be a huge problem. In Wilds, I never bring either of them, because there are plenty of slinger nodes that provide the drink buffs all over the map. And failing that, there's the supply drinks I can access anytime I'm on my sacred, making even the most important environmental features almost irrelevant. Beyond the environment and combat encounters, virtually all pre-quest ceremony has been removed. Previously, you'd have to choose a quest and then you'd stay in town, eat your meal, restock items, and change your gear. And if you forgot to update your inventory or even over-prepare for quests, there were consequences. The more limited inventory space often meant deciding whether it's more important to have tools to help your quest, or leave space for materials to bring back. And the more consumables you brought, the more you had to scroll through your inventory to find exactly what you need while the armored T-Rex with a sword for a tail is trying to eat you. It's that clunkiness leading to important decisions that really defined the uniqueness of Monster Hunter back in the day for me. It felt like you were really setting off for a distant land as a hunter, and the unique challenges presented by the monster and environment required careful preparation. And I feel like the flow of accepting a quest but not immediately departing and instead eating a meal strongly encouraged you to plan and prepare. If nothing else, they forced an extra 10 seconds where there's really not much to do other than remember what you needed to bring. In Wilds, none of that exists. You can choose a quest and select Depart Now, and your entire inventory is still accessible from within the quest. When you eat a meal, it lasts for a fixed duration shared across multiple quests, and if it runs out mid-hunt, you can cook another meal right there. If you wanted to argue that these changes are quality of life improvements and that Monster Hunter is more fun when there are no obstacles getting in the way of fighting the monsters, then great! I don't begrudge that position at all. For me though, those extra points of friction are really what separate Monster Hunter as I knew it from other third-person action RPGs. Let's talk about a big symptom of these changes, the acceleration of game pace. I can't be certain if this is intentionally designed for, or if it's simply a product of all the other factors. However, given its strong relation to everything else I've mentioned, I'm assuming the designers are actively trying to make this change. With the removal of the friction I mentioned before, there's less downtime from quests than ever by a long way. And likewise, within those quests, all the conveniences like the sacred, the fast traveling, slinger collection tend to hyperfixate on rushing straight towards the monster anytime you're away from it. But even if we zoom right into the moment-to-moment combat gameplay, there's an increase in tempo. Every weapon in Wilds has some combination of parries, offset attacks, perfect guards, perfect dodges, and pretty much every weapon has increased mobility and reduced commitment to actions. For most weapons, this means anytime you're not attacking, you should be looking to respond to the enemy as actively and offensively as possible. I've heard classic games described as semi-turn based. This was because when the monster attacked, you should be looking to avoid it and respond when there's an opening. Now, monster attacks are typically an opportunity to exploit. If you're playing longsword, you should ideally be parrying almost everything thrown at you to build your spirit gauge. If you're playing greatsword, you have hyper armor, offset attacks, and perfect guards. And if you're playing the bow, you must perform perfect evades often to maintain stamina and coatings. And look, I'm not denying that executing each of those is fun. It feels great to get those perfect evades, but equally, there's no denying that the game feels faster. Even item use has had this treatment. I once thought that being able to walk while drinking potions in World was an incredible change to the commitment of that action. But oh, how young and naive I was in a world without the sacred. Dart around the map while chugging potions, sharpening your weapon, or to just run in circles while you reach for Doritos. Need a mount? Just whistle over the sacred. And with the radial wheel and options like optimal healing or optimal status recovery, there's very little time or attention spent on finding the right item to use. Now, a consequence of this, one that first became very noticeable in Monster Hunter Rise, is that to compensate for the player's godlike potential, the monster designs are forced to be faster, more aggressive, have wider hitboxes, and chain attacks together. When you combine all these factors, the pace of the game feels absurd compared to what it once was. I want to take a moment to recap the points I've made so far and look at how that reflects on the overall experience. We have a series which once asked you to master a few distinct aspects of the game, but is sharply narrowing focus on the weapon mechanics now. Every point of friction that gets in the way of experiencing those weapon mechanics is systematically being removed. And the overall pace of the game is getting faster. Like many other players of this game, I feel the result of these factors is a game which feels less and less of a fantasy hunting simulation. The term monster fighter gets thrown around a lot, and I agree with the sentiment. I also find that a lot of the thinking and decision making around monsters and quests have been taken away. Instead, your cognition is largely spent on raw pattern recognition. And another symptom I experience from these changes is a lack of chaining goals together. To reach a certain milestone in Generations Ultimate, I would halt my main progress to improve my gear. The crafting materials not only required hunting multiple monsters, but also at times to do gathering quests to mine ores or catch bugs. But when you do those mining runs, you also get extra materials to trade for money to purchase the gear and get points for your farm, which helps with getting the consumables to tackle that milestone. In Wilds, I simply powered through story quests and stopped 2 or 3 times to farm a monster to make its weapon or armor. Again, I'm sure many people prefer not to be distracted from the core gameplay, but for me, these self-directed goals are far more meaningful than doing the main story missions. They're the unfolding narrative of my character, of the intimate story that player and agent share, not the one that the game prescribes. So that concludes the main points I wanted to cover, but there's one more sphere of fundamental design I'd like to go over, and that concerns the story, world building, and related topics. Let's touch on the story first. Again, I won't be spoiling any specifics, though I will be vaguely alluding to 1 or 2 of the narrative beats. There's no doubt that they've poured a lot of time and resources into the presentation of the story, through the cutscenes, the voice dialogue, and the quests. Regardless of whether or not the plot has inherent value, its delivery is nothing short of AAA, especially when you compare it to the classic games where we had cutscenes sprinkled here and there, but most of which were just brief monster reveals, and the vast majority of narrative and character interactions were delivered through stacks of unvoiced dialogue that I doubt many people had the patience to read. So clearly that was not ideal. Though I get the impression the developers of those classic games probably recognized that people would skip the dialogue, since outside of standing around and rapidly pressing A, there's no functional impact on your experience in games like Generations Ultimate if you skip through all dialogue. You might miss out on some useful tips, but almost everything is flavor and fluff with bits of story mixed in here and there. And that's a stark contrast from how the designers have crafted your interaction with the story in Monster Hunter Wilds. Even if you try to skip all the cutscenes and dialogue, you'll still have some sense of the overall story by the end of the game. Some cutscenes are unskippable, and you're forced to hear out certain dialogue. Most importantly are the quests that require you to explore alongside other characters. In that case, you're interfacing directly with at least that particular chapter of the story. At a minimum, simply through the act of seeing the first moments of a cutscene, only to skip it immediately, will have you conscious of the fact that there is a story here. Now, I don't think placing a different level of emphasis on story is inherently right or wrong. If a game's story is intriguing or has strong implications on the gameplay or progression, then I'll pay attention. And if the designers felt the story was important for expressing the game's vision, then I won't be upset with them for bringing it to the forefront. And conversely, if there is no significance to the story and it's kept out of the player's way, then that's fine by me. In Monster Hunter, it really comes down to whether or not the story's payoff is worth being distracted from the gameplay. The answer will vary from person to person. For me, it's not, and that largely comes down to the story and characters being so simple. Now, that's not necessarily a jab at the writers, since I don't think the world of Monster Hunter lends itself particularly well to a complex narrative or layered characters. At the end of the day, the story's job is to justify the player being the aggressor through hunting monster after monster, without breaking the spell of feeling like the protagonist. And I suspect it's difficult to maintain that without a simpler narrative. If I'm wrong about this, then, well, I hope Capcom decides to improve upon this area. Lastly, we have world building and immersion. As I mentioned earlier, Wilds has a lot of attention put into the presentation of the environment. From the earliest trailers, Capcom clearly wanted you to feel like this was a believable ecosystem, full of flora and fauna, all of it having a reason to be there. And when you stop and look around you, I'd say they achieved that effect, which is impressive given the scale of this game. The obvious difference between this style and the classic games is that they were working with a lot less. They had fewer resources and the hardware wasn't as powerful. With those limitations, they had to figure out how to design areas with only a handful of important interactions that wouldn't get tedious to see repeatedly. So for the most part, each zone in a map was given a purposefully unique design, both visual and functional. The colors and shapes are distinct, and most importantly for world building, the skyboxes were incredible. The developers simply couldn't build out the detail in a zone to anything that resembles today's standards, so they ensure that any time you looked out to the horizon, you'd be rewarded with a great sprawling vista. And if you couldn't see one, it was often because the area was supposed to feel smaller or claustrophobic. And since the map was broken up into zones, care was taken to build small-scale narrative through the environment. Most of the maps give you the sense that you're traveling great distances as you cross through the zones, and they give you space to imagine the journey. The difference in experience here is that Wilds wants you to feel amazed with the density of detail, and games like 4 Ultimate want you to see something beautiful yet vague and fill in the details with your imagination. There were also more liberties taken in those older games to have more of a fantasy aesthetic and be less grounded. I'll give an example of the type of thing I'm talking about. In Generations Ultimate, there's a map called the Primal Forest. At a glance, you can tell it's a part wetland, part forest, and the visual design of the zone gives you the sense that as you move north, you're ascending in elevation. At some point, I must have stopped to really look at my surroundings in one of the areas. What I noticed was large objects sticking out of the ground and shading the area, but not just trees. These were titanic bones of a monster, and it had been made to look like whatever it was had died a long time ago, with nature growing around the bones and its inhabitants unfazed by them. When I searched other areas of the map, I saw more of them, and I eventually realized this thing must have been a colossal serpent, maybe miles long. I was imagining what it must have looked like and what effect it must have had on the land as it traveled through. Why was it here? When did it die? How did it die? Was it slain by another monster or hunter? I love that sort of thing, when there's just the right amount of information shown to let your imagination run like crazy. In modern games, there generally isn't space for that type of storytelling. All the gaps are filled with ecology and we've moved away from most of the fantastical elements. I find the giant rock formation in the background of the Windward Plains to be intriguing in that kind of classic way. When I saw it, I wondered what formed this, or what carved it. Is it natural, or does it represent some kind of technology? I'd love to see more features like that, but that's pretty much all there is for me in Wilds besides the Wyverian ruins. The developers of Monster Hunter have always wanted you to feel immersed in the realism of their monsters and environments. And I think Wilds has taken those elements to their logical conclusion with modern technology. It truly has environments that feel real. I'm not convinced that Wilds has fully realized that goal of immersion though. Partly because I feel more immersed when I'm using my imagination, but also because my experience playing through Wilds was constantly interrupted with cutscenes and being forced to look and interact with my surroundings. When a game continuously switches between high and low amounts of agency, I find it very jarring. It breaks my immersion. Again, I'm not trying to say one approach is objectively better than the other, but when you unpack both like this, there's a clear difference in experience. Alright, that wraps up all the design fundamentals that I have the scope for here. Throughout this video, I've stressed that most of these differences aren't necessarily better or worse, and I stand by those remarks. I think that if Wilds was the first Monster Hunter game I played, it's totally possible I'd think it's great, if a little easy. Now, I'm not trying to hide the fact that I much prefer the classic games. I think Monster Hunter is at its best when its focus is spread across the weapons, the monsters, and the environments, because I can't get that experience anywhere else, and I like that the game offered ways of compensating for lacks in mechanical skill. Your knowledge of those games makes all the difference. Whereas Wilds feels more like a well-polished AAA action RPG with a unique hook in that you're always fighting bosses. And it seems that the new formula is great for attracting mass market appeal, particularly in the West. Unfortunately, for those of us who prefer the classic experience, I think Wilds proved that unless there's a very strong reason to compel them otherwise, Capcom will continue to push the series in this new direction. They are a business after all, and the last few entries in the franchise have sold better than any other game Capcom has made. With all this information, it's easy to feel hopeless about the future of the series when you're fond of the older style, but there is room for hope and to be constructive. A lot of the lead up to the release of Wilds showed that the developers actively listen to the community and make changes based on trends, and so you'd assume that they'd be more attentive than ever in the early weeks after a major release. If you're like me and want to see the series reclaim some of what made it truly unique, then we should use the greatest tool at our disposal: conversation. Let Capcom know that there is an appetite for the core design tenets of the past, and try not to let the discussion get totally dominated with obvious problems like performance. Take a constructive approach with your feedback. Point out the precise problems. Discuss what exactly worked about the previous entries. And don't allow yourself to be absorbed in frustration or despair. It's hard for the developers to action vague comments like, "This game sucks compared to World." Even if the mainline series won't turn back, there's no reason to say spin-off games couldn't test the waters if they felt there was enough of an audience for it. And if Capcom won't do it, some developer out there will yearn to see it realized and make it themselves. Okay, that's about all I have to say for now. Thank you for choosing to spend your time on this video. This topic is very dear to me, and I've tried to treat it with the effort and thought it deserves. If you found it engaging, please leave the video a like. If enough people enjoy it, I'll try to make similar ones in the future. Enjoy your day and happy hunting.